This is November 2024, and this is the third week of AD16, additional material number 16, Ava's letter to the Pathwork community, written in 1977. This section, I collected the information on daily tasks, internal and external. And here are the 3 items that came up for me about this section. One is that she talks about having been in shock. I think people underestimate how often we go into some level of shock. So I went to Wikipedia and looked up shock and reactions, and I knew fight, flight, freeze. But when I went there, information changes over time. I found there's a commonly known fourth one now called fawn. Of course, it's a deer story with the deer running away or freezing. So fawn, probably because it starts with the letter F and has to do with deer. But I liked it. And I liked it because it is another dimension of what we do when we're in shock. So what is shock? Shock is when the body senses or the mind senses that something is deadly. Some mechanism, some part of us is headed towards death. And to fight that off, systems have to be shut down. Something has to be radically changed. Something has to go in a different direction or shut down or. So the freeze is obvious, total freeze. And when I say shock happens more than we realize, early in my Pathwork career, I was invited gently to notice when I held my breath, when I had an emotional reaction of any kind, and I just stopped breathing. Now, it was invisible to me. So perhaps you can imagine that I'm working something out and they say you stopped breathing. Well, of course I haven't stopped breathing, I'm alive. But that's not what they were referencing. Instead of a natural breathing with my words, taking in the oxygen I needed and putting the words out, I caught myself. And they were trained to notice that, where I took in a small breath, or I froze slightly. Once again, they were trained to know what that was about. I was blissfully ignorant. And that is the tiniest example of shock, where you realize something, or you hear something, or you think something that is a violation of something. It's shock. Let's just use the word shock. And when you do that, the system freezes. Now, it always freezes. The freezing may be very, very minor. And then it may go into another reaction. It may go into fight, where you start arguing or protesting or building up some energy. That's a fight reaction. It may go into flight, where you're defensive and you want to get distracted and want to move away from whatever that is. The fawning is suddenly wanting to cling to the other being, the other energy entity, the group. If you feel alienated from a group, you'll want to grab a hold of the group and hug it because you want to feel safe. Again, all of this is generated from a sudden realization that something is dangerous. It irritated me when they pointed this out to me, but a lot of things are irritating when you are caught doing them and you don't realize that you've done them. So I got over it. And then I started to catch myself. I spent years noticing where I would stop breathing or just the tiniest freeze. And then what I would do in response to that. So you freeze to figure out what to do, and then you do something. Or sometimes you just stay frozen. And then, of course, years later, I would do the same thing to my clients. and they got irritated, and boy, did I understand that. I have a lot of empathy towards my clients because I remember being pulled out of my ignorance, pulled out of my unconscious state into awareness, and there's a protest to that. So shock. These reactions are instinctual. They're not intuitional. They're instinctual because they have to do with survival. Now, human beings are complicated, so survival has multiple layers. The Maslow triangle of concerns we have uh, starts with physical, it goes to emotional, mental, social, self-will, and then spiritual. So that any one of those layers can feel threatened. I can feel threatened that my reputation is at risk. I can feel threatened that my professional status is at risk, that I'll get fired. I can feel threatened that my friendship is at risk, and that's my social emotional core. I can feel threatened physically by minor things that don't seem terribly important at the time. The idea is to begin to learn how many times a day you go into shock, how many times a day you come to that standing perfectly still, freezing, and then take a reaction afterwards. It's important self-knowledge, and I advise it very, very strongly for you to pay attention to what you do, and it's fairly easy. One of the easiest ways to notice is the breath, where we just suddenly change our breathing or stop and then start again. It's subtle, but you can feel it. So you can train yourself to become aware of these things. And it's surprising once you do that, how many times you will go into that. So I did all that about shock to talk about survival, the instinct for survival. The minute that instinct is engaged, it has imagined some form of threat to life. It may not know what life it wants. It may not know what yes choice there is. But anytime that instinct is activated, it knows what it doesn't want. It knows something needs to be avoided, stopped, fixed, covered over, ignored. And so the idea is the minute you do that, you're in duality. You're in a life-death duality. And so I have found it very helpful to notice where I go into a life-death duality. Now, what I'm getting at is you may not be able to articulate what the so-called life is. You may not be able to articulate what the so-called death is. But once you've got that, I can't do that, I have to do anything else, or I'm going to lean this way. Interpret that, interpret the direction you go in as life affirming. This is from Pathwork Lecture 143, Unity and Duality. Interpret wherever you want to go as life affirming, because we never run towards death. Anything you're avoiding reeks of death in some way. So the minute the instincts are activated, you're looking for the way out. You're looking for anything that is more lively, more life affirming, even if you don't quite understand what you're running away from. Again, that may sound vague. I find it to be something I can feel in my body, and it's instant information for me that I've gone into duality, and I'm not seriously considering all the options in front of me because I've made a primitive, primeval decision not to go in one direction. So one set of options is off the table. And that may be real and it may not be. It may be realistic, it may be fair, it could be simple prejudice or fear. So once you decide what life affirming or deadly is, dangerous is, one side creates the other side of the equation. Rather than fuss about trying to articulate all this stuff. It's not necessary to articulate it. My suggestion is to notice the flow and notice where you want to go or what you want to avoid. What I often do is suggest to people that when they're going towards something, they're actually running away from something, and to feel it on their back, to feel the danger on their back, and even glance over their shoulder a little bit and take a peek at what they might be trying to avoid. Now, why am I going into all that? Because when we talk about daily tasks, internal and external, very often there's a protest. People protest. Now, again, they may not protest in a way that is clearly identifiable. They may go into boredom or ennui or distraction or denial or procrastination or a flurry of activity where something else is automatically terribly important. When I have a chore that I don't want to do, other chores become far more attractive. And I'm very happy to go over and do those, as long as they'll keep me from doing the chore I don't want to do. If I peek over at this chore I don't want to do, again, this takes time. It takes, you have to become familiar with yourself. And what I have become familiar with is the core reason that I hate certain tasks is they're grindingly slow. I cannot expedite them, and I have to do them alone. There is something deadly about having to do something step by step that takes an hour and a half, and there's nothing I can do to make it fun or juicy, and there's no companionship to it. And over the years, I found that by realizing that that same chore in a group of companions is not so bad. That same chore, if I can speed it up, is not so bad. That same chore, if I feel that the outcome will make me happy, is not so bad. But when it just has to be done, there's no joy in it. And it will go to the bottom of any list of to-do activities that I have to create. It's death. To me, that is death. Now, that's not a huge example, but the idea is there's going to be a range of life-death decisions that we make, and it's really important to become familiar with the subtle ones. So, any protest to a task or something that you have to do is an indication of a no current. Now, no currents are covered in Pathwork Lecture 125. So the no current, the desire to push away or say no to something, would always be because there's some quality of death involved with it. Something you feel you have to give up to do it. Something you feel you can't be if you have that, if you engage fully with that task. And so this is where I come from when people protest. I use the Shakespeare line, methinks the lady protests too much. When I hear protest, that's a form of flight. That's a form of fight. That's a form of trying to get me to agree that this couldn't possibly be very important. It's a fawning attempt to try to enlist support. Why? Because there's something we are afraid of doing that we don't want to do. No chore is that terrible. And once I get my head straight and do the chore, I very often chuckle to myself as I do it, because why it took 3 months for me to get around to doing some dumb 1.5 hour, 2 hour chore, when it wasn't that hard and there were actually some pleasure involved with it. All I can say is that that's where I've figured out that I had superimposed upon that chore this sense of death, being chained to something unfun by myself, And so I have to get over that. And I may need some mechanical ways to get over that. You invite friends over to do the chore. You, there's lots of popular suggestions. You set a clock and you do it for 5 minutes at a time. Go take a break, come do 5 minutes. All of these are ways of taking apart the global protest, the big no, slicing into smaller pieces so that you can work with it. So I thought that it would be more helpful to focus on that than to simply praise Ava for the work that she did, taking care of herself, spiritually, emotionally, physically, doing what doctors told her to do, reaching out, getting help, taking the help in, saying yes to whatever would be life affirming for her. So that's my bit tonight on AD16, Ava's letter to the Pathwork, when she was recovering from surgery in 1977.